Throughout its history, humanity has created an incredible array of melee weapons, with a significant number of these inventions emerging during the Middle Ages. Despite the dizzying variety of designs, most weapons share a common theme: a long object with its center of gravity shifted one way or another, delivering, depending on its design, slashing, cutting, piercing, crushing, or a combination of these types of damage. Shifting the center of gravity toward the opposite end from the grip, like with a mace or axe, maximized striking power. On the other hand, moving the center of gravity closer to the grip reduced striking force but improved maneuverability. Classic examples are swords and rapiers. As I've mentioned before in another video, crafting melee weapons is always about balancing power and control, choosing between a strong strike or precise fencing ability. But what was the most destructive melee weapon of the Middle Ages? The internet is full of lists showcasing different examples, but authors rarely explain their choices. The katana often makes an appearance. Like any saber, the katana's center of gravity is set well away from the hilt, about a palm and a half. This suggests it wasn't designed for classical fencing, but rather for delivering swift, unexpected strikes. That said, calling a katana a sword isn't exactly wrong. Long-bladed weapons share enough similarities to be considered part of the same family. Terms and definitions vary across cultures. The slight curve of the katana's blade allows it to deliver saber-style slashing cuts, highly effective against unarmored or lightly armored opponents. However, when faced with an enemy in steel armor, katanas, sabers, and similar cutting weapons, longswords included, were much less effective. The better the armor, the less relevant the blade. Some might argue that katanas, like other swords and sabers, could also stab, and thrusts are indeed effective against armor. That's true to some extent, but the katana's slight curvature and shifted center of gravity make it less suited for thrusting compared to a straight sword. A sword, however, is outmatched in thrusting power by a spear. Essentially, long-bladed weapons are versatile tools, but that versatility comes at a cost. They don't chop as well as an axe of similar weight, nor do they thrust as effectively as a spear. Spears, while simple and efficient weapons, also came with compromises. Blacksmiths had to make the tips thin and angular to pierce effectively, but this reduced the size of the wound. While thrusting wounds can be fatal, especially when they hit vital organs, they generally lack immediate stopping power. Overall, piercing weapons aren't typically classified as destructive. They're better described as precision tools, capable of delivering small but potentially lethal wounds while bypassing armor more efficiently. But before we get to the truly destructive weapons, let's clarify what destructive really means. Put simply, the impact force of a weapon depends on its mass and speed. Roughly speaking, a hammer weighing half a kilogram moving at 10 meters per second will hit with the same force as a 1 kilogram hammer moving at 5 meters per second. Although in practice, it's a bit more complex. Take a bullet, for example. Despite weighing just a few grams, it carries more energy than a hammer many times its weight due to its incredible speed. From this, we can conclude that the faster a weapon moves, the more energy it generates. Speed can compensate for lower mass. This brings to mind the image of long-bladed weapons like sabers or swords, which can be wielded with great speed. However, there's an important clarification to make. The high maneuverability of swords comes from their center of gravity being closer to the hilt. This allows quick repositioning since much of the mass is concentrated near the grip, making it easier for the wielder to transition between strikes. But the actual speed of the strike, whether it's delivered with a sword, axe, hammer, or mace of comparable weight, doesn't differ dramatically. It's worth noting that most one-handed weapons rarely exceeded 1.5 kilograms, while two-handed weapons typically ranged between 3 and 4 kilograms. Nobody tried to create a 50-kilogram sword because weapons needed to be fast enough to wield. If you could swing something weighing 10 to 15 kilograms like a barbell, you wouldn't even need a blade. You'd just crush your opponents. And this brings us to the most interesting category: blunt force weapons. Imagine being tasked with breaking down a brick wall using any medieval weapon. Chances are you'd pick something heavy with a solid striking surface. Against an unarmored person, bladed weapons like swords are deadlier than, say, a mace or warhammer. But once good armor enters the equation, swords and sabers would leave only scratches. On the other hand, heavy blunt weapons can dent armor, break bones, or at least knock someone off their feet. In essence, piercing and cutting weapons are clever designs, attempts to make lighter weapons more lethal through sharpness and precision. Blunt weapons, however, are heavier, simpler, and in a sense, more honest. They deliver immense energy with each strike and distribute it over a larger surface area. As a result, it doesn't matter whether the target is a lightly clothed opponent, an armored knight, or even a brick wall. If we're talking about sheer destructive power in a single blow, heavy, two-handed blunt weapons take the crown. One standout example emerged in Europe alongside plate armor: warhammers. Craftsmen, or perhaps the fighters themselves, realized there was no need for both striking surfaces to be identical. They started adding a spike, or beak, to one side of the hammer. This allowed not only crushing blows but also puncturing armor when necessary. These spikes didn't require shifting the center of gravity, so this added versatility didn't compromise the weapon's effectiveness. Warhammers were always around but became particularly prominent in the 14th century. Compared to maces, warhammers typically had greater mass. Soon, infantry began using longer hafts to counter mounted opponents, leading to pole weapons like the Lucerne hammer and the poleaxe. These combined crushing, piercing, and even slashing capabilities. Their shafts were typically 1.5 to 2 meters long, with an average weight of around 3 kilograms. Don't be misled by that modest-sounding weight. If you visit your local hardware store, you'll find the average sledgehammer weighs about the same. Surprisingly, the poleaxe was also used in duels and even judicial combat, common medieval practices for settling disputes without witnesses. The weapon became a favorite among the upper class, featured in 15th and 16th century tournaments. About a third of its shaft was reinforced with steel strips, and if it broke, the fighter was left with a shorter but still effective version. Another notable weapon was the two-handed flail. During the Hussite Wars, Czech peasants wielding flails successfully repelled 5 crusades, decimating Europe's knightly elite. Though not the sole reason for their victories, these flails, adapted from farming tools, left a lasting impression. By the late 15th and 16th centuries, manuals and illustrations began appearing detailing their use. A combat flail typically consisted of a shaft just over a meter long, a chain, and a striking head made of wood or steel. These weapons could reach a total length of 180 centimeters, offering considerable range. Parrying or blocking a flail strike was extremely difficult. It was simple, cheap, and effective. Even a one-handed flail with a striking head weighing less than 200 grams could break any bone in the human body. The takeaway here is straightforward. To be destructive, regardless of the opponent's armor, a weapon needs substantial mass. It's like heavyweight boxing. A fighter may lack the agility of a lightweight, but delivers the most powerful punches. Before you declare crushing weapons the MVP of medieval warfare, remember this. If they were so amazing, we'd see knights swinging hammers in every painting, but we don't.